Well, you've finished week one, or what I'm calling week one of this course. You've read a number of poems and a couple of pieces of prose in genres of Old English writing that cover pretty much all the bases for what people in the Anglo-Saxon period were concerned about. Number one, you've read about the heroic code of battles. The Anglo-Saxon period was a time of great warfare, an awful lot of fighting in between kingdoms and within kingdoms, between nations and within nations. You've read poems that we put in the elegiac genre that talk about the sorrows and the griefs that are the norm in a society which is so much marked by warfare. Of course, this is a universal theme, the theme of transience, the theme that the good things of life tend to wear away, people pass away, we lose things, and all the good things that we cherish so much are ultimately destined to vanish. Life itself will vanish. You've read some religious poetry, and you've read some historical prose. Now we turn in this week, which I'm calling week two, although you may be working on a different schedule than that. Week two has to do with Beowulf. If you've read the introductory remarks in the course syllabus, you have seen that the poem is the longest surviving poem in the English language of the Anglo-Saxon period. The poem is 3,182 lines long, so it contains about 1/10 of all the surviving poetry in Old English. The poem I've called a poetic omnibus of most of the important genres in Old English. It is a collection of passages that have to do with battle. They have to do with elegiac lamentation over loss. It has proverbial statements sprinkled throughout. It has historical implications, and it has some very subtle, or we might say muted, religious elements to it. Let me say a little bit more about that. The poem is written about a period of time in Scandinavian history when the tribes and the characters that are represented in the poem could not have had any contact with or knowledge of the Christian religion. It wasn't really until the later Middle Ages that Scandinavia would be evangelized by representatives of the Catholic Church. It wouldn't be until the year 1000 that the Icelanders would be converted to Christianity. The Danes were converted somewhat earlier. So the poem, which talks largely about Danish and Swedish and other Scandinavian tribes, cannot really be said to come from anything that has anything to do with a Christian view of the world. But that's the story. The poem, the Old English poem, was written in the late Anglo-Saxon period by a poet or a scribe or a collection of scribes who were very definitely Christian. They were probably monks. Most of them were no doubt male members of monastic societies. It's not impossible that a woman could have written Beowulf, but it's unlikely given the statistics of what we know about literacy and the numbers of people in convents, nunneries, and monasteries. The poem is principally connected with the heroic code. Now you may remember that the Battle of Malden in the previous lessons reading material and in the questions that I've asked you to answer in the essay topics, the Battle of Malden was a very important representation in poetic form of the principal aspects of the heroic tradition as the Anglo-Saxons maintained it after the migration to the British Isles. The Anglo-Saxon heroic code was never spelled out in any precise formulaic form, but it was implied by a number of passages in some of these poems. The Battle of Malden is probably the most important short poem exemplifying those who both adhere to the provisions of the heroic code and some of those who fail to live up to it. Beowulf is another one, in which the heroic code is implicit throughout. You have to read interpretively, though, in order to understand what the Beowulf poet thought constituted the ethical system of heroism as it applied to warriors in the Anglo-Saxon period. So the issue is the heroic code. The issue is what makes a good warrior, and connected to that, what makes a good king. You will note, I hope, as you read through the poem, that there are 3 kings in particular about whom the poet, narrator, says specifically, he was a good king. These kings are King Scyld, the great founder of the Danish dynasty, whose funeral forms the opening episode in the preface of the poem. The second person who is called a good king is Hrothgar, the later successor to the Danish throne, and the ruling king at the time when Beowulf comes to Denmark in order to deal with Hrothgar's monster problem. Then later on in the poem, after Beowulf himself has become a king of his own kingdom, much later in the tribe or the land of the Geats, Beowulf is called a good king. As you read, I'd like you to ask yourself in the back of your mind, what is the poet trying to say about what constitutes good kingship, and what is he implying about what constitutes effective heroism in this war-torn world? Another couple of things I want to tell you before you begin the week's reading. J.R.R. Tolkien, who's famous for The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and other works, was in his professional life a scholar of Anglo-Saxon literature, Old Norse literature, and a specialist in Beowulf. In 1936, J.R.R. Tolkien gave one of the most important lectures about the poem that has ever been given, and this was later turned into an essay, published again in 1936, which was entitled Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics. Very quickly, very briefly, what Tolkien tried to say was that earlier scholars of literature had paid not enough attention to the poem as a work of literary art. Earlier scholars were more interested in it for its historical value, for its reflection of the archaeological and mythological realities, or the folklore and legends of the Scandinavian North, but they really didn't have an appreciation for it as a work of poetic literature. Principally, their objection to the poem, he says, was that it was centered on fabulous monsters. I mean, fantastic imaginary creatures. 2 trolls at the beginning, Grendel and Grendel's mother, whose name we don't know, and then later at the end of the poem, a dragon that Beowulf is called upon to fight and slay. Tolkien assessed the earlier critical scholarship and said that scholars had, in a way, turned up their nose at the poem, thinking it was rather trivial, focusing on imaginary creatures, sort of a cartoonish version of heroic events. Tolkien said that's not the case, that in fact it's not a triviality. In fact, it's a very important thing that the hero in this poem has to fight supernatural monsters. In this sense, says Tolkien, Beowulf and his heroism are raised from the level of simple, mere human heroics to something like cosmic heroics. Especially in the fight with the dragon, Beowulf is engaged in a fight with a monster who has traditionally been used within the Christian tradition, within the biblical tradition, as representing satanic supernatural evil. So he says it's not an accident. In fact, it's a deliberate thing, and it is a positive thing that the poet has focused on Beowulf's fight with the monsters, and the poet has relegated to the marginal aspects of the poem some of the other heroic aspects of human feuding and that sort of thing. Now, human feuding does play a significant role in the poem. As you read, you will encounter a number of instances where the poet refers to infighting within tribes or between tribes, and where feuding tribes make an effort to secure a lasting peace by several methods, one of which is by intermarriage. Several female characters in the poem, notably Wealhtheow, Hrothgar's wife. Wealhtheow, the Danish queen, was herself, says the poet, a member of a rival tribe called the Hemmings, and her marriage to Hrothgar was meant to secure a lasting bond of peace, a permanent peace treaty between the two tribes. Other characters also fit that same description. In addition, there were peace treaties that were concluded or brought about by fostering. The son of one tribe or one branch of a family is sent to be reared and taught and educated and brought up in the court of another king as a foster son. And so, in particular, uncles and nephews are an example of this. You might note that at the beginning of the poem, Hrothgar at his court has his brother's son, the son, his nephew, being named Hrothulf. And you'll note that toward the end of the poem, Beowulf is the nephew of his king Hygelac, the king of the Geats. All these are evidences of efforts to secure peace and to bring feuds to an end by significant relationships between tribes or tribal units. So Tolkien's 1936 lecture was one of the most important ones. It really did have a great deal of success in convincing the intellectual world of the 1930s that Beowulf ought to be paid attention to in the academic world. And as a result, largely, of Tolkien's efforts, the poem Beowulf became a sort of standard piece to be read in introductory courses to the history of English literature in England and in America, where it remains today, an almost unavoidable literary work when you're in a course like this one. A few more random comments here before you begin reading. Note that the poem begins with the funeral of Scyld, the founder of the Danish dynasty, and it ends with the funeral of Beowulf. I'm sorry if those of you who have never read the poem are disappointed. I've just introduced a spoiler. No, Beowulf does not survive the end of this poem. But he does a lot of great things in the middle, and that's what the poet is trying to communicate to us. There are a number of funerals in the middle, a number of people who pass away, both within the overall plot, the outer plot of the poem, and within the digressive plots, the stories within the story that tell of the outcomes of tragic feuds and betrayals, treachery, warfare, and the resulting deaths of people. So keep alert to the fact that you'll be reading about a number of deaths and funerals. On the positive side, the poem has a lot of treasures in it, a lot of reference to gold and jewels and silver and gems, gem-encrusted sword hilts, and decorated armor, decorated shields, and decorative helmets, battle helmets. The poet loves treasure. He loves gold, and the treasure of the dragon, the dragon's hoard at the end, is described in a number of passages in really magnificent ways. Treasure is an important symbolic feature of this poem, and so as you read, take note of what are the valued things, what are the valuable goods that are exchanged or fought over or given as gifts or received as tribute by various members of the tribes that are referenced in these stories. One last comment. Some of you may be a little concerned that there are not very many female characters in this poem. I'll tell you that when my wife and I watch movies, she wants to know, is it a guy movie or is it a girl movie? If it's a guy movie, she might watch it if there's a significant female character or two that she can identify with. Well, there are a number of key figures of the female persuasion in this poem. First of all, there's Wealhtheow, the wife of Hrothgar, the queen of the Danes. She may at first appear to be a trivial character, but watch and listen when she is given actual speeches that are quoted in the poem. Pay attention to what might be going on under the surface or between the lines of what Wealhtheow is saying in her public speeches that she gives, first of all to her husband, Hrothgar, and then secondly to Beowulf, who's just won a great victory by slaying Grendel. There are other female characters who appear primarily in the digressions in the poem. That is, again, the stories within the story that are alluded to or summarized by the poet. One of them is Hildeburg. She appears in a digression on a massacre in Phrygia. Another one is a character whose name is Freyawaru, odd name, who is the daughter of King Hrothgar and Queen Wealhtheow. She's a female character that we're not introduced to in the actual portions of the poem that are set in Denmark. We only learn about her existence later on when Beowulf goes back home to the land of the Geats and gives a summary to his king Hygelac concerning the events in Denmark. There, Beowulf tells us Hrothgar has a daughter, and that daughter is promised in marriage to a rival tribe. She's supposed to provide the connection that will perhaps bring to an end the feuding that has gone on between the Danes and the Heathobards. That story is interesting as well. There are a couple of other female characters who are mentioned. Lastly, there's a female character in the form of Grendel's mother. Yes, even monsters have mothers, the poem seems to suggest. And before you write off this monster as just a female troll, again, I'd like you to pay attention as you read. Why does the poet describe her in the way he does? And why does the poet fit the story of Grendel's mother's attack upon Hrothgar's court exactly where he does in the sequence of the plot, in relation to, say, the digression about Hildeburg, or in relation to Wealhtheow and her political speeches? I think it all adds up to an important theme, and you may have an opportunity, or you may take the opportunity, to write about the role of women and what the poet is trying to say about the female perspective on the heroic tradition. In summary, then, this is a poem about heroism told primarily through the eyes of the great heroes and great kings of this imaginary period, but it's also got a significant piece of, or a significant perspective that adopts the feminine point of view or is sensitive to the female experience of the heroic world. I hope you enjoy it. It's one of my favorite works of English literature, probably largely because it was one of Tolkien's most favorite works. Enjoy, and see you on the other side.